I used to believe our life together was unshakable. We had built it slowly, brick by brick, moments of laughter, shared meals, whispered plans for the future. My partner, Armin, had always been the steady presence I leaned on. His calm voice could soothe any of my storms, and his smile had a way of making the world seem less heavy. In the quiet corners of my mind, I counted myself lucky. It was during one of those quiet months that Rafi entered our lives. He was a friend of Armin's from years back, newly returned to the city. Armin spoke of him warmly, how they had shared long nights studying, how Rafi had a knack for turning the most mundane day into something memorable. I welcomed him without hesitation. From the beginning, Rafi carried himself with an ease that made him instantly likable. He had a quick wit, a way of leaning in when you spoke, as if every word mattered. He helped us with odd errands, stayed for tea when Armin invited him, and often left us with the echo of his laughter in the hallway. At first, I thought nothing of it. Friends came and went in our lives, and Rafi seemed grateful for a place where he belonged. But there was something in the way Armin's eyes lit up when Rafi appeared, subtle, fleeting, yet enough for me to notice. It was the sort of expression you'd expect from someone spotting an old photograph they had almost forgotten existed. Days slipped into weeks, and Rafi became a regular presence. If Armin had to run errands, Rafi often tagged along. Sometimes they disappeared into the study for work-related discussions, the sound of low murmurs filtering through the closed door. I told myself they were simply catching up, but a small, unfamiliar unease began to grow in the pit of my stomach. Still, I brushed it aside. Love, I reminded myself, is built on trust, and suspicion can be its undoing. Armin had never given me a reason to doubt him. Besides, Rafi was polite, even deferential, when we spoke, never crossing boundaries, never saying anything that felt inappropriate. One evening, as the three of us sat in the living room, the conversation drifted to old memories they shared from their college days. They laughed over stories I'd never heard before, inside jokes that shut me out without malice, but with an unmistakable sense of exclusivity. I smiled along, though something about being on the outside, looking in, left me quietly unsettled. When Rafi finally left that night, Armin lingered by the door longer than usual, watching his friend disappear into the shadows of the street. I caught that look again, the one I couldn't quite name, part nostalgia, part something else. I didn't know it then, but that glance would be the first thread in a tapestry I wasn't ready to unravel. It began with small things, the kind of details you could dismiss if you wanted to, but once you start noticing, it's impossible to unsee them. Rafi's visits became more frequent, slipping into our evenings without much warning. Sometimes he'd call ahead, but other times he'd simply arrive, claiming to be in the neighborhood. Armin never seemed to mind. In fact, he welcomed him every time, his voice carrying that familiar warmth, as if no matter what plans we had, Rafi's presence made them better. I started noticing how often they found reasons to be alone. A quick talk in the study. A short walk to the corner store. Sometimes Armin would leave with him after dinner, promising they'd be back soon, yet returning long after the streets had gone quiet. Each time, he'd brush it off with a vague explanation, we lost track of time, or we ran into someone on the way. The most unsettling moments came when I walked into a room unexpectedly. Their conversation would halt, replaced by a strange silence too thick to ignore. They'd exchange a glance, almost as if deciding silently how to proceed, and then Armin would steer the discussion toward something harmless. One evening, I came home earlier than planned. I found them in the kitchen, leaning over the counter, speaking in voices low enough to be drowned out by the hum of the refrigerator. When they noticed me, both straightened too quickly. Armin smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "We were just talking about an old friend," he said. Rafi nodded, his expression unreadable. The more I observed, the less I could tell myself it was nothing. The way Armin's attention seemed sharper when Rafi spoke. The subtle tension in the air when the three of us sat together. Even the way Rafi's eyes would flick toward me and away again, as though measuring my awareness. I told myself that love requires trust, but trust isn't blind. It notices the tremors in the ground long before the quake arrives. And in our home, the tremors were becoming too frequent to ignore. One night, I overheard them in the living room while I was upstairs. I couldn't catch every word, but I heard Armin's voice, low and urgent. "Not now. We'll talk when it's just us." My chest tightened, the meaning of those words sinking deeper than I wanted to admit. I stood at the top of the stairs, torn between stepping down and confronting them, or retreating to the safety of pretending I had heard nothing at all. In the end, I turned away, but the sound of those words followed me into every corner of my thoughts. It was no longer about whether something was happening, it was about when I would finally see it for myself. It was a Tuesday evening, the kind of day where everything felt ordinary until it wasn't. I had stayed late at work, determined to finish a project that had been hanging over me. But midway through the evening, a sudden headache made me decide to leave early. I didn't call ahead. Part of me thought it would be a nice surprise to come home sooner than expected. The hallway outside our apartment was quiet. As I turned my key in the lock, I caught the faint sound of voices, low, hurried. My first thought was that Armin had invited Rafi over again, but something in the tone made my pulse quicken. When I stepped inside, the living room light was dim. Armin and Rafi were there, seated close together on the couch, their heads bent toward each other. The space between them was so narrow, it felt almost deliberate. For a moment, neither of them noticed me. When Armin finally looked up, his expression shifted in a flash, surprise, then something guarded. Rafi straightened immediately, leaning back as though the air had suddenly become too warm. "I didn't know you'd be home this early," Armin said, his voice just a shade too calm. "I wasn't planning to," I replied, setting my bag down slowly. My eyes moved between them, searching for answers in their faces, but all I found were unreadable expressions. Rafi stood up, smoothing his jacket. "I should go," he murmured, avoiding my gaze. He was out the door before I could say a word, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than any argument. I turned to Armin. "What was that?" My voice was steady, but inside, my thoughts were splintering. "Nothing," he said quickly, too quickly. "We were just talking about old times." But old times didn't explain the look I'd seen in his eyes before he realized I was there. It didn't explain the way the room had seemed to tighten around them, the way Rafi had fled as though staying another moment was impossible. The rest of the night passed in fragments. Armin moved through the motions, making tea, asking about my day, but every gesture felt like a shield. I answered him with quiet nods, my mind replaying the scene over and over. The closeness, the startled expressions, the unspoken words hanging in the air. I didn't press further that night. I didn't need to. Some truths don't require confessions. They reveal themselves in the space between words, in the weight of a glance, in the sudden awareness that the person you love is holding something back. As I lay awake, later, staring at the ceiling, I realized the question was no longer if my trust had been broken. It was whether I was ready to face what that meant. The days that followed were quieter than I could bear. Armin went about life as if nothing had shifted, but I moved through each moment with the heaviness of someone holding a secret they never asked to carry. Every glance, every word between us, felt measured. The easy rhythm we once had was gone, replaced by pauses that lingered too long in conversations that never went beyond the surface. I tried in my own way to convince myself it could pass, that maybe I had misread everything. But trust, once fractured, has a way of showing you the cracks no matter how you try to look away. The image of them together on the couch replayed in my mind without mercy, accompanied by the weight of Rafi's quick exit and Armin's guarded expression. One evening I asked Armin directly, not with anger, but with the kind of calm that comes when you already know the answer. "Is there something you want to tell me?" His eyes flickered for the briefest moment before he shook his head. "No," he said, but the hesitation was there. Small, almost invisible, yet impossible for me to unsee. That was the moment I understood the truth in its entirety. I didn't need an admission. The absence of honesty was an answer in itself. From then on, I stopped searching for explanations. I stopped trying to patch the silence with small talk or forced smiles. Instead, I began quietly reclaiming my own space. I spent more time outside the apartment, met friends I hadn't seen in months, and rediscovered the version of myself that existed before the weight of suspicion settled on my shoulders. It wasn't easy. There were nights when the ache of what I'd lost, both the love and the trust, felt unbearable. But somewhere within that ache, I began to see a truth I had ignored for too long. Love cannot survive in the absence of honesty. Eventually, I told Armin I was leaving. His reaction was subdued, almost resigned, as though he had known this day would come. There was no grand argument, no last-minute confession. Just a quiet acceptance that what we had built was beyond repair. As I walked away from that chapter of my life, I thought of all the moments that had led me here, the warmth of our early days, the laughter that once filled our home, the subtle glances I had dismissed. They all formed a story I could never unwrite. But I also carried something else with me, a lesson. Trust is not just given, it is protected, nurtured, and honored. And when it is betrayed, the greatest act of love you can offer yourself is the courage to walk away.